You actually highlighted the clause, like with a yellow marker? He snorted, waving the contract like it was a cocktail napkin. That's adorable. The room chuckled low, smug, complicit. My jaw didn't move. My heart didn't even tick faster. But I mentally penciled a little black X over his name. It was my 14th year in that office, and I knew how to spot rot before it smelled. The new VP, Chase, yes, Chase, because of course that's his name, had rolled in 2 months prior like a frat boy who won a startup in a raffle. Business school haircut, loafers without socks, and an MBA from a program I suspect required at least 2 Instagram stories per week. His LinkedIn said things like disruptor and operational Sherpa. Mine had one word, compliance. Most people didn't even know I had a law degree. I didn't advertise. I didn't grandstand. I didn't raise my voice when leadership accidentally set vendor net terms to 120 instead of 30. I just attached a snippet from the procurement reg to my weekly report and let it do the screaming. Look, before we go further, this story gets good. Like, federal auditor crashes your board meeting good. So if you're listening and haven't subscribed yet, take a second. It really keeps this old compliance team caffeinated, and honestly, intern gets very emotional when the likes go up. Keeps her from crying over Excel formulas. Anyway, I'd built a career being unremarkable on purpose. Beige sweaters, quiet entrances. I was the kind of person you saw in the break room and assumed had been there since the building was constructed. That was fine, that was safe, until Chase arrived. Day one, he moved into the corner office like he'd paid rent. Didn't shake my hand, didn't ask what I did, just pointed at the wall of binders behind my desk and said, "Are those, like, real files?" I thought everything was digital now. My eyes smiled. My mouth didn't. 2 weeks later, I was left out of the annual vendor audit prep call. Not by accident. His assistant CC'd everyone in purchasing and ops and tagged it need decision makers only. I sat there, watching the invite flash across my screen like a mosquito you know is gonna bite someone else first. It never survived an audit without me. Hell, they barely survived lunch without me flagging allergen disclosures. Chase strutted around the floor like he'd discovered synergy. I'd watch him hold coffee cups like props, say things like "let's circle back offline," and use the word leverage like it was punctuation. I've seen goldfish with more institutional knowledge. He couldn't name a single clause in our ethics charter, but he gave a whole presentation to the board on agile integration philosophies. Still, I stayed quiet. I kept notes. And when I was pulled from the manufacturing safety subcommittee and replaced by someone who once said, "Wait, OSHA person, right?" I smiled and kept filing. My boss, Darren, was useless. An old warhorse turned show pony, more interested in golf than governance. Chase had him wrapped around his little uncalloused finger within days. It'd vanish for strategy lunches and come back reeking of whiskey and enthusiasm. I get follow-up emails telling me my risk assessments were overly cautious, and my documentation created friction in agile alignment. Translation: I made it harder to lie. One morning, I walked past the conference room during a core leadership sync, and Chase was mid-story about how he once closed a contract by sending a client a meme of Vince McMahon. They laughed. I walked on, printed an extra copy of the whistleblower policy and slid it into my personal folder at home. They thought I was decoration. They forgot I had teeth. The moment was coming. I just didn't know yet it would begin with a single line, uttered between sips of coffee and ego. 7 words that would collapse their little tower of charisma and buzzwords. Compliance is just paperwork, he'd said. And when he said it, the room laughed again. But I didn't. The meeting was held in Conference Room C, colloquially known as the icebox, because the AC always blew like it was trying to refrigerate regrets. I was seated 2 chairs down from Chase, across from the new supplier rep, a man who looked like he was still nursing a Monster Energy hangover from 2013 and wore a blazer over a graphic tee that said "grind sleep." Chase was in rare form, legs kicked out, grinning like he was running a casting call for a reality show called America's Next CFO. "So walk us through your integration roadmap," he said, leaning forward like he had any idea what an ERP compliance module even was. The rep gave a half-baked pitch about modular optimization and elastic component chains, which sounded like he'd eaten a supply chain white paper and vomited it onto the table. Then he said it. "We're still in the process of getting listed on the federal vendor database, but we're confident it'll be approved in the next quarter." I blinked. A little too long. I cleared my throat. "Just to confirm, your firm is not yet approved under DFARS 252.204-7012 for handling CUI data related to defense components." The rep froze for a millisecond, then nodded slowly. "Right, but we're almost there. It's just a formality," Chase chuckled. "Come on. Compliance is just paperwork. I heard it. So did everyone else." They laughed. Light, easy. Like he'd just made a harmless dad joke instead of publicly waiving federal reporting obligations in a room full of people holding contracts tied to national supply chains. My hand didn't tremble. I didn't even blink. I just reached down, discreetly tapped my phone screen under the table, and let it capture the next 30 seconds. That was all I needed. You have to understand, in compliance, silence is our sniper rifle. You don't go screaming through the halls when someone screws up. You document, you timestamp. You let them walk into their own shadows. And in that moment, hearing him laugh about the regulatory backbone of our entire industry, I felt something old crack clean in half inside me. 14 years of we'll fix it next quarter. 14 years of being too cautious, too slow, too bureaucratic. 14 years of watching decisions get made in bars, not boardrooms, and then being asked to make it all look legal in the reports. Compliance is just paperwork. You don't recover from saying that. Not when you've got 7 active contracts under GSA oversight and a half dozen procurement cycles tied to DoD grant compliance. But no one else flinched. No one else paused. The project manager to my left even smiled and said, "We'll just have legal give it a once-over." That was the moment, that right there, I realized I wasn't in a meeting. I was in a crime scene, just one where the body hadn't hit the floor yet. Afterwards, Chase gave me a little wink on the way out. "Lighten up, Barb, you worry too much." I smiled, told him I appreciated his leadership. Then I went back to my desk, pulled up our vendor database, and downloaded the active federal supplier list for Q2, confirmed the rep's company was still unlisted, cross-checked their onboarding docs. 4 signatures were missing. The kicker? Someone had marked the supplier as compliant in our internal risk tracker 3 days before the meeting even happened. I opened a blank email, entered a single recipient. Investigator 1 at Ofbagov subject. Vendor on contract hash B 14927C body. Please see the attached clip from our vendor call regarding contract ID B 14927C. Attached, audio clip 614 BMP3. That was it. No sign-off, no signature block, no company footer. Just silence wrapped in a MP3 file. The moment I clicked, I felt no fear, no flutter, no heat, just clarity. Cold as the AC in room C. And from that point forward, every time Chase opened his mouth in a meeting, all I could hear was paperwork burning. I sent the email from my personal laptop in my car in the far corner of the parking garage, the level where the motion sensor lights take 3 seconds to flicker on, and the only constant noise is the low hum of a dying vending machine. I parked there often. No one else did. It was the one place in the building that didn't pretend. My finger hovered over the send button for maybe half a second, not out of hesitation, out of ritual. I was saying goodbye to something, not my job, not even my peace, just the illusion that the system would ever fix itself. Click, gone. The moment the email left my outbox, I felt a strange stillness. Not calm, not relief, like the air had paused, like the story had changed chapters and no one else had noticed yet. I didn't have to wait long. By the next morning, a request came through per routine audit tracebacks asking for a full vendor compliance chain on any recent component partnerships tied to federal grants. It was polite, phrased like a seasonal check-in. But the document list they included? Surgical. They knew exactly what they were looking for, which meant someone had read my clip. Someone had listened to Chase's smug voice bouncing off those cheap conference room walls and thought, "Oh, that's actionable." I kept my face blank when I passed Chase in the hallway. He was complaining to our legal intern about how red tape ruins innovation. I didn't slow down. I had a folder to finish preparing, one that listed every procurement form Chase had touched since his first day, and which ones magically skipped signatures, compliance review, or both. By lunch, procurement was in a tailspin. Some senior manager in vendor relations, Margaret, sweet woman, who microwaves fish in the break room and has no idea how contracts work, emailed the entire department asking if anyone had ever requested a vendor override on contract ID B 14927C. I replied within minutes. No documented override request or sign-off exists under that contract ID. Current supplier remains non-compliant under DFARS clauses as of Q2, per internal process flagging for review. No one responded, but I noticed Margaret walked past my desk 3 times that afternoon and didn't meet my eyes. That evening I was working late. Chase wandered by, sipping something brown from a metal thermos like he wanted everyone to know he drinks whiskey, neat even when it's just cold brew. "Hey Barb," he drawled. "Heard some noise about contract B14 whatever? Legal's getting twitchy." I glanced up. It's probably just a standard request. They run randoms all the time. He chuckled. "Yeah, still, make sure you've got your boxes checked." "Always do," I said and smiled. He walked away. I opened my compliance dashboard and pulled up the digital audit logs. His login had accessed 6 files tied to that vendor in the last 24 hours. 2 were marked read only. Restriction I placed. He tried to edit them anyway. I added the intrusion attempt to my external folder, not the company drive, a real folder with paper, ink, dated. I've learned to keep analog backups. You can't gaslight a hard copy. Later that night, I walked past the glass lobby, empty, dim, the kind of place that looks like it forgot people once worked there. I stood there a moment, staring at my reflection in the glass. Not tired, not scared, just precise. The game had changed. I wasn't a bystander anymore. I was in motion. No more documenting messes after the fact. No more burying warnings in footnotes. This wasn't cleanup. This was targeting. They never heard the shot. They still don't know they've been hit. but the bullet's already in the air. The federal inquiry notice came in with all the subtlety of a polite threat. Subject line in all lowercase, signature from a name no one recognized, and language so deliberately vague it might as well have been written in fog. Please provide clarification regarding internal protocols and compliance verification documentation for recent vendor onboarding related to Contract B 14927C. No further action required at this time. The phrase "no further action" is a red flag in our world. It's the kind of thing you only write when you're definitely taking further action but want to see who panics first. I watched it land in the inboxes of legal, operations, and procurement. It didn't hit mine. I only knew about it because Margaret, the fish microwaving, contract forwarding manager, had the good grace to forward it with the comment, "Thought you should see this." She didn't look me in the eye when she passed my desk, just kept walking like she hadn't just slid a live grenade under my door with a post-it on it. 20 minutes later, Chase strolled through the office holding his phone like it was a prop in a play he didn't rehearse for. "Anyone else see that weird email from the feds?" He called out, grinning. Probably just some intern trying to make a name for themselves. The room chuckled. Everything was a joke to him, even the slow tightening of the noose. That day, I noticed I was no longer on the weekly manufacturing ops sync invite. The calendar event had updated silently, attendees trimmed, no explanation. It used to be my meeting. Now I was a ghost with a desk and a nameplate no one made eye contact with. Then came the printer. I'd printed risk matrices from the same office printer for 12 years. Every Thursday, color-coded, double-sided, like clockwork. This time, the job hung, then disappeared. I walked to the printer. The little screen said, "Access denied." I tried again, same thing. Someone had removed my badge permissions just for that printer. Not the one by legal, not the one by HR, just that one. My usual one. It was petty, intentional, and exactly the kind of psychological move people like Chase think is clever, like putting a passive-aggressive note on your keyboard that says, "Clean me," and thinking it's management. I stood there a moment, alone in the humming silence of the supply room, staring at the printer like it had personally betrayed me. Then I walked back to my desk, calmly opened my personal laptop, and added a new entry to my external log, event #42 badge restriction on common use printer in finance pod. Timestamp, 11:13 a.m. No change request submitted. No known security justification. I closed the file and sipped my tea. They thought they were isolating me, cutting me out, weakening my position. But the opposite was true. See, when people stop including you, they forget you're still watching. They act like you can't see what's happening. Like you don't have proxies, workarounds, allies too tired of the chaos to speak but more than willing to forward an email or send a screenshot at 7 p.m. after a couple glasses of wine. Margaret wasn't the only one. I started receiving little fragments. Slack messages, anonymous DMs, notes left under my door. Each one like a breadcrumb in a story everyone sensed was spiraling but no one dared narrate. Did you notice Chase edited the onboarding doc retroactively? Legals asking if the vendor was pre-approved. Wasn't that your call before? Procurement just scrubbed the timestamp logs. Not sure why. They were watching too. The house wasn't burning yet, but the floorboards were hot. And I'd stopped looking for exits. Now I was watching for load-bearing walls. It hit legal first. Wednesday morning, 9:02 a.m., just as the espresso machine outside their office hissed like a warning flare. A second email from the Office of Federal Procurement Audits. This one not vague, not polite, not vague or polite. It was surgical. Please provide full documentation of vendor approval workflows, internal risk assessments, and compliance logs related to Contract B 14927C. Specifically, date-stamped records from 03/01 to 05/18, associated correspondence, and system login records tied to document modifications. There was no further action line this time. Just a due date, 48 hours. I watched the panic bloom through the glass walls. First, junior paralegal sprinted past me holding a legal pad like it might burst into flames. Then the GC herself stormed down the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, eyebrows in full crisis arch. 2 minutes later, my inbox blinked to life with a message from legal. "Can you confirm if you retained backup logs from Q1, Q2 vendor reviews?" I didn't reply immediately. Not out of spite, out of protocol. I opened my personal backup folder, yes, the analog one, and flipped through a stack of labeled manila envelopes until I found the one marked Q1 vendor integrity chain. Inside, printed compliance checklists, annotated onboarding steps, and hard copies of 2 email threads Chase had accidentally failed to forward to legal. One of them had a red flag for me, dated March 4th, warning, supplier currently unlisted under DFARS. Approval pending. Do not onboard until confirmed. I sent the scanned copy back with a single sentence. See attached logs for requested range. Nothing more. By noon, the CTO had summoned his usual trio of whispers into his office. His door shut with a kind of finality, like a man locking himself in before the storm broke through the windows. I saw the calendar event go live. Emergency risk exposure review 6 o'clock p.m. invitees. CTO, General Counsel, VP Operations, CFO. Chase was in the room before it was even scheduled. Of course he was. At 5:47 p.m., I received a calendar cancellation for the Thursday budget allocation meeting. Agenda shift. Meeting rescheduled. Translation, we're hiding now. I stayed at my desk, didn't pack up, I waited. At 6:13 p.m., long after most of the floor had gone dark and only the vending machine's glow kept the hallway alive, I saw them emerge. The CTO looked like he'd swallowed glass. Legal avoided my gaze entirely. Chase, he still grinned, but his left shoe was untied. That man never had a detail out of place. The cracks were spreading. The next morning, I wasn't invited to the leadership status briefing either. Closed door, soundproofed, scheduled hastily. You could smell desperation on the invite. I walked to the printer, still denied, so I printed it elsewhere, and I backed up every file I'd ever touched on that contract. I copied server logs, exported login metadata, re-downloaded archived vendor correspondence, printed every version, filed it, labeled it. Then I did something new. I created a binder, not for me, for them. One section for each executive who signed off on the vendor. A timeline of edits, highlighted inconsistencies, blank approvals. One page titled Legal Risk Exposure Projected Fallout. No commentary, no analysis, just facts with timestamps. I placed it in a drawer with a single sticky note on top, if asked. By the end of the week, I'd noticed that procurement had gone completely silent on Slack. No banter, no memes, just a black hole of unacknowledged questions and invisible replies. Then on Friday afternoon, one of the junior IT guys, Jeremy, I think, approached my desk. He looked pale. Hey, weird question. Did you run any permissions changes on Chase's files? I blinked. No, why? He shrugged, fake casual. Just some logs showed admin overrides from your account. Thought maybe it was a glitch. I stared at him. I haven't touched Chase's files. You should escalate it if there's an anomaly. He nodded, too quickly, walked off. I waited 5 minutes, then opened my access log. Found exactly what I expected. Someone had cloned my login and tried to pin a document change on me. It failed. My audit log caught the conflict. I printed it, dated it, filed it under a new label, tampering attempt stage 1. The escalation had begun, and I wasn't scared, I was ready. The access log didn't lie. Friday night, 10:42 p.m., long after the janitorial staff had vacuumed around the interns' beanbags, and the lights dimmed low enough to forget who you stabbed for corner office, someone used temporary admin credentials to dip into my compliance drive. Specifically, the folder labeled Federal Ready, Contract B 14927C. The audit trail flagged it in yellow, accessed externally via VPN. User not recognized. Device ID unknown. Session ended after 42 seconds. 42 seconds. Just long enough to panic. Not long enough to understand what I keep in that folder. I didn't raise a flag, didn't even report it to IT. I just took out my legal pad, wrote down the timestamp, underlined it twice, and stapled it to a printed screen capture of the log. Then I locked it in my external binder under the divider marked Retaliation Passive Stage. Monday morning. HR called me in. Carol from HR looked like someone who'd gotten her degree in workplace harmony from a YouTube certificate course. She smiled like a flight attendant asking if I'd like to crash in the mountains or the sea. She gestured to a chair, folded her hands, and said the line I'd been waiting for. We wanted to talk to you about a potential development opportunity. That phrase should come with a siren. She handed me a printed memo, unlined copy paper. HR font. We believe your deep experience and attention to detail would be invaluable in a strategic culture and values coordinator role. Translated, we want you as far away from compliance as legally possible without firing you and triggering a whistleblower clause. I read it twice. Looked up. Will this change my access credentials? Oh, we're still finalizing that, she said, too quickly. But yes, it would reduce your exposure to sensitive regulatory data. Help you focus more on mentorship and culture metrics. I smiled. Genuinely. Wonderful, I said, and folded the memo gently into thirds. Carol blinked. Probably expected a fight or confusion or tears. She didn't expect me to ask if I could have a printed version for my records. I walked straight to the mailroom, printed it again, date, time, badge number in the corner, then walked back to my desk, pulled open my bottom drawer, and slid it into the external binder. New label, attempted reassignment phase 1. Chase wasn't even subtle anymore. That afternoon, someone from facilities came by and asked if I wanted to schedule a desk relocation to the new culture and values pod. I declined politely and logged the timestamp. Then I changed the label on my Slack status to working in place until transition details confirmed. No one responded. The silence was louder than anything. In the halls, people started lowering their voices when I passed. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The ops lead, a man who used to ask me about every acronym in our contracts, suddenly started emailing my junior associate instead. Chase, meanwhile, was doing laps in the office like he'd already won. He stopped by my desk once to offer a smug little shrug. Nothing personal, Barb, just realignment. We all have to play to our strengths. I looked up from my screen, didn't blink. Thanks for the feedback. I've been documenting everything. His smile faltered for half a second. Half a second was enough. By Wednesday, I got word from Jeremy in IT, via a mysteriously anonymous message forwarded from a burner Outlook address, that my cloud folders had been flagged for redundant data storage. He included a screenshot. A request to disable, sync, and archive local copies of non-critical materials was signed off by someone in facilities, not IT, not legal, not even Chase. They were laundering the sabotage now, using proxies, paper trails too clean to point directly but clumsy enough to stink. They wanted my files gone, my access gone, my fingerprints wiped from the crime scene, but they didn't understand the depth of my redundancies. They didn't know about the binders, the backups, the terminal I ran from home once a week, mirroring key directories the second any change occurred. I didn't need the company's drives, I was the drive, and now, the files were just kindling. I wasn't holding logs anymore, I was holding a match. Subject line, no reply needed, that was it. No greeting, no footer. Just one line in the body of the email, thank you, see you tomorrow. It hit my inbox at 6:12 p.m. on a Thursday night, just as the last of the sales team stumbled out of the break room arguing about cold brew ratios like it was a religion. I read it once, then again, closed my laptop, locked the external binder, and left the office for the first time in weeks before the sun dipped below the rooftop HVAC unit. That night, I didn't pore over audit logs or annotate tampering timestamps. I lit a candle, poured wine, put on vinyl, slept with my phone off, because I already knew. Friday morning hit with a weird kind of pressure, like the air inside the building was heavier, thicker, like the ceiling tiles knew what was coming and were trying to brace themselves. Chase wasn't in yet. Unusual, considering he usually strutted in like a Peloton instructor off-cycle, ready to ruin someone's morning by 8:15. At 8:36 a.m., security buzzed the front desk. I watched from the window above the printer hallway, yes, the same one I'd been locked out of 2 weeks ago, as a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a man in a gray federal issue suit, crisp as fresh litigation. He carried two things, a government laptop and a portable speaker. Not a backpack, not a briefcase, just that. He didn't say much to the receptionist, just showed ID and nodded toward the elevators. I followed our distance. Quiet shoes. No eye contact. He was escorted to the 12th floor. Executive, that's where the board was gathered for their quarterly strategy session. Everyone who mattered was already inside. The CEO, the CTO, the VP of Ops, legal, and yes, Chase, who'd apparently shown up 5 minutes prior looking like he hadn't slept. I wasn't invited. Of course not. But the hallway leading to the boardroom had a glass partition, half frosted. And I'd learned over the years exactly where to stand if you wanted to see without being seen. I stood there now. At 9:01 a.m., the federal agent entered the room, placed the speaker on the table, opened his laptop, and calmly connected the two. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the audio. Come on, compliance is just paperwork, Chase's voice. Echoing, confident, stupid. You could see the shift ripple through the room. First, the CFO leaned back, then legal sat forward. The CTO blinked slowly, like someone recalculating their entire life insurance policy. And the CEO, he didn't move at all, just stared at the speaker like it had personally insulted his bloodline. The agent let the silence settle after the clip finished. Then, with an almost theatrical slowness, he turned his laptop toward the CEO. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw his lips. Explain this. Not can you explain, not do you want to clarify, just the command, explain. Chase tried to speak, raised a finger, then stopped. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The federal agent didn't look at him, didn't even acknowledge him. Then the CEO finally moved, lifted one hand, gestured toward legal, like maybe she'd produce a miracle or an alibi or a time machine. She just shook her head. There was no defense, not for this. Not for the cascade of falsified sign-offs, the vendor approvals written in future tense, or the recorded proof of institutional negligence. That's when the agent finally said something I could hear, even through the glass. Who oversaw compliance for this vendor? Every head in the room turned, not toward Chase, toward the empty seat across the table. Mine, and then finally the CEO spoke. Where's Barb, a board member, someone who once called me paper wallpaper in a staff mixer, stood and opened the door. His voice was quiet, too quiet. Could you join us? I didn't smile. I didn't move fast, but I stepped into that room like I'd lived there all along. The only thing louder than the speaker on the table was the silence that followed me in. The room smelled like desperation masked in citrus, some overzealous attempt to spritz away the stench of fear with overpriced eucalyptus bergamot air freshener. But nothing could scrub what had just echoed off those glass walls. Compliance is just paperwork. The clip had finished playing, again by request, and this time no one laughed. The federal auditor, Mr. Haverson, according to the badge clipped to his belt and the subtle scowl welded to his face, closed the laptop with the slow finality of a judge slamming a gavel. He turned toward the CEO, who sat rigid, fingers tented like he thought geometry might save him. Please explain this mindset. 6 words, flat, deadpan, lethal. The CEO, Charles Ellison Roman III, yes. The kind of man who makes sure you know he's the third, blanched so hard you'd think someone unplugged his skin tone. His mouth opened like it wanted to form a rebuttal, but only found air and regret. I don't condone that statement, he stammered. It's not reflective of our values. The auditor didn't blink. Your values are not under audit, Mr. Ellison. Your practices are. That's when legal started whispering. Fast, urgent. The GC leaned over, lips near the CEO's ear, fingers jabbing softly at a folder filled with documents I could already tell were out of date. Chase sat frozen, elbows tight, that frat boy confidence drained from his pores like someone had popped him with a pin. I stood by the door, still as a statue, the room's eyes sliding toward me one by one like they'd just remembered I existed, and that they'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. Haverson turned to me. Ma'am, he said, respectful but firm. You oversaw compliance during the onboarding of vendor Delta Resin LLC? I nodded. I did. And did you raise concerns about their approval status? Yes, multiple times, documented in internal emails and vendor review logs. He gestured toward the board table. Please join us. The chair next to legal was suddenly vacated with a speed that made it clear the occupant had no appetite for heat. I sat, folded my hands, zipped my slim binder. Not the full external one, just the curated summary. 10 pages, no more, not a single wasted sentence. I slid it across the table. Here are the compliance assessment logs, onboarding records, sign-off trails, and the revised vendor status as of the week of March 6th. I've highlighted the flagged discrepancies and included an appendix of system login attempts associated with document edits. Haverson flipped the pages. So did the board. No one interrupted. For the first time in my career, not a single executive man in that room dared speak over me. The CTO glanced at a timestamped login attempt. Was this from your account? I shook my head, spoofed. Audit log caught it. I reported it internally. No response. The CFO leaned forward. You flagged this in March, I nodded. Correct. And no action was taken? None that I was copied on. Chase redirected the workflow through facilities. Non-compliance rated access point. That was a kill shot. The auditor closed the binder, slid it back to me with an almost imperceptible nod, and turned to the CEO. Mr. Ellison, you will provide the full compliance chain for this vendor and any others onboarded under your VP's supervision in the last 6 months. If this mindset, he pointed back at the speaker, is systemic, the penalties will be significant. The CEO didn't respond. He just stared at the table like maybe it would cave in and bury him alive. Also, Haverson added, Miss Parker, finally, someone used my name will need unrestricted access to all compliance documentation moving forward. We will be coordinating directly with her for the internal audit. No one objected, not legal, not ops, and definitely not Chase. In fact, Chase suddenly found something very interesting on the floor, as if maybe the carpet pattern would teach him how to avoid prison. The meeting moved on without him. As I stood to leave, the auditor gave me a quiet nod. Not gratitude, not even approval, just recognition. I was no longer paper on the wall. I was the one holding the receipts, and they knew it. They didn't even have the decency to wait until Monday. Friday, 4:41 p.m., 20 minutes before close of business. Just enough time for the announcement to hit like a bomb and leave everyone to stew in it over the weekend. A formal HR bulletin landed in inboxes across the company. Effective immediately, VP of Operations Chase Whitaker is placed on administrative suspension pending a third-party investigation into federal compliance violations. Questions may be directed to legal or the interim compliance oversight chair. No email signature. No thank you for your service. Just a digital guillotine, clean, sterile, and final. My name wasn't in the body of that email, but everyone knew who the interim chair was. I walked the floor like a ghost turned solid. People looked up from their screens and then quickly down again. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Slack channels fell into eerie silence. Chase's office door was closed, but the light was off. By 5:05 p.m., his nameplate was already gone. He never even packed his things. That night, as I passed his old glass-walled kingdom, I paused for a moment, hand brushing the doorframe. I remembered the first time I stood in that same spot, ignored, underestimated, invisible. Now, the office was empty, but the system was active, rebooting. Down the hall, the printer room door beeped open on the first try. My badge worked again. Not a word, no apology, no official reinstatement notice. Just quiet reaccess. Like the company hoped I'd forgive the attempted exile if they gave me back a functioning card reader and didn't make eye contact. I printed exactly one thing, my audit plan. 17 pages, indexed, time-stamped, annotated with a clause from the Code of Federal Regulations right at the top. As per 48 CFR Section 52.203-13, we are obligated to report any credible evidence of misconduct. That line had been laughed off by people like Chase for years. Too long. But when the board convened Monday morning, same glass-walled room, different tone, their smiles didn't reach their eyes. No jokes, no Barb, keep this quick. No sighs when I used full clause citations. They listened. I stood at the head of the table, pointing to a timeline that traced every falsified sign-off, every backdated document, every attempt to bury my reports under HR memos and printer lockouts. I explained how vendor approval chains had been rerouted through departments with no regulatory training. I showed the downstream risk exposure, contracts that could collapse, Federal funds at risk of clawback. Lawsuits waiting in the wings. The same people who once dismissed me as detail-oriented to a fault now leaned in, scribbled notes, asked thoughtful questions. Even legal nodded, not out of obligation, out of fear. Because they finally understood I hadn't been waving red flags, I'd been holding the detonator. The CEO was noticeably absent from that meeting, called to a federal compliance hearing, escorted by 2 attorneys and what looked like the weight of 5 million misjudgments on his shoulders. I never got to see him off, didn't need to. His story wasn't mine. Mine was this, standing in that boardroom, not shouting, not pointing fingers, just explaining calmly, clearly, coldly how close they came to collapse, not because the system failed, but because they ignored the one person who knew how to keep it breathing. The final scene was simple, glass-walled room, a whiteboard behind me, audit schedule outlined in dry erase. Around the table, the entire leadership team, not slouching, not checking phones, not glancing past me toward the next meeting, just listening. As I spoke, no one interrupted. Not once. And when I finished, the CFO said, softly, whatever you need. I nodded, closed my binder, picked up the marker again. They thought they'd silenced me. But all they did was give me the microphone. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.